Every year, something extraordinary happens. With no maps, no leaders, and no visible signals, billions of animals begin to move. From the scorching plains of Africa to the frozen rivers of the north, from skies that span entire continents to the depths of the ocean, life sets itself in motion. But this is not a simple journey. It's a race against time, against hunger, and against death. Some will travel thousands of miles, others will face obstacles that seem impossible, and many will never make it. And still, they continue. What drives such different creatures to follow the same instinct? Is there an invisible force connecting these migrations, an ancient rhythm that keeps the planet alive? Today, we follow it. Because in nature, there is a silent rule. Those who don't move fall behind. Movement begins long before it can be seen. Subtle changes start to take shape in the environment. Daylight stretches, temperatures shift, and the air carries new signals. For most species, nothing seems different. But for others, it's enough. A quiet cue that it's time to leave. On the plains of East Africa, that signal arrives with the scent of rain. Still distant, almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to change everything. Herds of wildebeest begin to move, at first without a clear direction, then with remarkable precision. Within days, the landscape transforms. What once felt empty becomes a constant flow, a movement that grows, intensifies, and refuses to stop. And this is not happening in just one place. Across the planet, the same impulse emerges. In the sky, birds gather and test the winds. In the oceans, giants shift their roots. In rivers, ancient cycles awaken. None of this is random. Every movement follows a precise rhythm, shaped over thousands of years. Migration is not just about traveling, it's about timing. Because arriving too early or too late can change everything. And as these movements begin, one thing becomes clear. This is not just motion. It's an entire system coming to life. And if you enjoy exploring phenomena like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because when this system falls out of balance, the consequences reach far beyond a single species. In nature, every departure carries a silent question: continue or disappear. Across the vast plains of East Africa, the movement finally takes shape. What was once scattered groups now becomes one of the largest gatherings of land animals on the planet. More than 1 million wildebeest begin moving almost at the same time, as if responding to an invisible signal. There is no leader showing the way, no clear starting point, and yet they all follow the same direction, driven by one goal: to find life where the land is still green. The dry ground begins to tremble under the constant impact of thousands of hooves, lifting clouds of dust that stretch toward the horizon. From a distance, the scene looks like a dark river crossing the savanna, but this river does not stop, does not turn back, and does not slow down. It grows. Among the wildebeest, other travelers join the journey. Zebras move side by side, relying on memory to recognize ancient paths, while antelopes follow the flow, alert to every sign of danger. This is not the migration of a single species, but a collective movement that transforms the entire region. Every step consumes dry vegetation and opens space for new growth, triggering a cycle that supports countless forms of life. But this advance comes at a cost, and not all can pay it. In the middle of the crowd, the youngest and weakest begin to fall behind. And on the savanna, falling behind is rarely an option. Hidden in the tall grass, watchful eyes follow every movement. Lions observe in silence, choosing the exact moment to strike. Contrary to what it may seem, Hunting here is not just about strength, but precision. 1 second of distraction, one wrong step, and the chaos of the herd becomes an opportunity. Farther away, hyenas follow the migration with a different strategy. They don't need to hunt constantly. For them, the journey of others is already enough. Remains, mistakes, exhaustion, everything can be used. For some, migration is survival. For others, it is a season of abundance. But what truly drives this movement is not danger, not yet. It is a promise. Somewhere ahead, the rain has already fallen. And where there is rain, there is fresh grass, water, and the chance to continue. The wildebeest cannot see their destination. They do not know exactly where it is. And still, they move with astonishing precision. Guided by signals science is still trying to fully understand. The smell of wet earth, subtle changes in the air, even the direction of the wind may influence their path. It is a complex system, refined over thousands of generations. As the days pass, the rhythm accelerates. What seemed like a simple movement becomes urgent. The distance between life and scarcity shrinks with every mile, and time begins to press down. Because on the savannah, abundance does not wait. It appears, changes, and disappears quickly. And those who arrive too late find only what remains. This is the first great challenge of migration, knowing when to leave. A mistake here does not only mean delay, it can trap the entire herd in a cycle where hunger arrives before opportunity. And when that happens, the journey can end before it has truly begun. As the movement continues, what once seemed like a coordinated journey begins to reveal a deeper complexity. The savannah is not an open road, and the abundance the wildebeest are chasing is also in motion, shifting with the rhythm of the rains. This means the path is never straight. Small changes in weather can completely alter the route, forcing the herd to adjust constantly. And as they move forward, another migration begins to unfold above them. In the sky, flocks of birds appear like living lines stretching across the horizon. Unlike the wildebeest, which follow the land, these travelers depend on wind, temperature, and even the position of the sun to navigate. Some will cover even greater distances, crossing entire continents without stopping for days. Among them, the Arctic tern carries out one of the most extraordinary journeys in the natural world. Each year, it can travel over 40,000 miles, linking the Arctic to Antarctica before turning back again. To achieve this, it doesn't fight its environment. It works with it. Air currents, pressure systems, and climate cycles become invisible highways in the sky. Every shift in direction is part of an instinctive calculation of remarkable precision. But even that precision has limits. Sudden storms can scatter entire flocks, pushing them off course into dangerous or food-scarce regions. And in the air, there is no shelter. Meanwhile, in the oceans, another migration is already underway. Far below the surface, humpback whales leave cold, nutrient-rich waters and head toward tropical regions. But unlike what might be expected, they make this journey while barely feeding. It is an extreme energy trade-off. They exchange abundance for reproduction, relying entirely on the reserves built up over months of feeding. Along the way, they cross vast stretches of ocean where food is scarce, face changing temperatures, and protect their calves, which must keep pace from the very beginning. Every movement matters, because here, energy is survival. What's most striking is that, despite unfolding in completely different environments, all these journeys follow the same underlying rules. Birds, land mammals, and ocean giants all respond to the same signals: timing, food, and reproduction. It's as if the entire planet operates on a single invisible clock, synchronizing species that will never meet, yet depend on the same conditions to survive. Together, these movements form something much larger than any single migration. They create a global system in constant motion. But as this system expands, so do the risks. The greater the distance, the greater the exposure. The longer the journey, the smaller the margin for error. And little by little, what began as a response to the environment becomes a true test of endurance. Moving forward is only part of the challenge. The real test is making it to the end. And not all will succeed. As these migrations unfold across the planet, one thing becomes clear. Migration is not just about moving, it's about timing it perfectly. In many cases, reaching the destination is not enough. It has to happen at the exact right moment, not earlier, not later. On the African plains, after weeks of movement, the herds finally arrive in regions where the rains have already passed. The land, once dry, now reveals a fresh layer of life. And here, one of the most precise events in the entire migration takes place. Within just a few days, hundreds of thousands of wildebeest calves are born almost simultaneously. This is not coincidence, it's strategy. By concentrating births into such a short window, the species overwhelms its predators. They simply can't keep up. It becomes a matter of numbers. But being born here guarantees nothing. Within minutes, the calves must stand. Within an hour, many are already trying to run. There is no space for prolonged weakness. The herd keeps moving, and falling behind is not an option. Around them, lions and hyenas increase their activity. For them, this is the most favorable time of the year. What represents a beginning for some is an opportunity for others. And that balance repeats itself day after day, with each new generation trying to keep pace with the movement. But this level of precision is not limited to the savanna. In other parts of the world, an equally demanding cycle is unfolding. In the rivers of the Northern Hemisphere, salmon enter the most critical phase of their migration. After years in the ocean, they return to the exact place where they were born. Not approximately. Exactly. They navigate using chemical signals in the water and even the Earth's magnetic field. But knowing the way does not make the journey easier. The moment they enter freshwater, everything changes. The current demands constant effort. They stop feeding completely. Every yard they gain depends entirely on the energy stored over years. The river pushes against them, turning every movement into a struggle. Jumps, falls, repeated attempts. Some manage to overcome the obstacles, others fail, and disappear along the way. This is where the true logic of migration reveals itself. Surviving the journey is not enough. It has to be synchronized with time. Arriving too early means facing an environment not yet ready. Arriving too late means finding resources already depleted. Between these two extremes, there is only a narrow window, and everything depends on it. When this balance holds, the system works. But when it slips, even slightly, the consequences spread quickly. Births no longer align with abundance. Movements begin at the wrong time. Routes stop working the way they once did. What once seemed perfectly tuned begins to show its limits. Because in nature, it doesn't take a major mistake to face the consequences. Being out of sync is enough. And when that happens, migration stops being an advantage and becomes a risk. As the migrations continue, an unavoidable pattern begins to emerge. Not all can keep up. What started as a powerful collective movement slowly begins to fracture under pressure. On the African savanna, the wildebeest push forward. But the gap between the strongest and the most vulnerable becomes increasingly clear. Newborn calves, exhausted mothers, and injured individuals begin to lose their place within the herd. And in the wild, losing position means becoming visible. Lions don't attack the entire herd. They wait. They watch. And when they identify a weakness, they act with near-perfect precision. The chase is short, intense, and decisive. Within seconds, the fate of one individual is sealed, while the rest continue moving as if nothing happened. Not out of indifference, but necessity. Stopping is not an option. The same principle repeats itself in other environments, under different rules, but with the same outcome. In the ocean, whale calves face a less obvious threat. They must follow their mothers on a long and demanding journey. But here too, predators are waiting. Orcas patrol key migration routes, especially during peak movement periods. They know these paths as well as their prey. And when the moment comes, they work together, using coordination and intelligence to isolate a calf. The encounter is rarely balanced. Even for massive animals, the ocean can quickly become a place of vulnerability. In the sky, the challenge takes another form. Migratory birds facing strong headwinds or sudden storms can be pushed hundreds of miles off course. That small deviation can lead them into regions where food is scarce, leaving them with little chance to recover. And unlike on land, where stopping is sometimes possible, in the air, every decision is continuous. There are no real pauses, no easy corrections. Exhaustion doesn't always mean an immediate fall, but it builds quietly, reducing the chances of survival with every mile. Meanwhile, in rivers, salmon face one of the most demanding forms of natural selection. With every obstacle they overcome, their energy declines. Their bodies begin to show clear signs of wear. Wounds appear, scales deteriorate, and the constant effort leaves a permanent mark. And still, they push forward. There is no turning back. This is a one-way journey. From a distance, migration looks like a display of overwhelming strength. But up close, it reveals something far more demanding, a continuous process of selection. At every stage, the environment sets the conditions. Endurance, precision, adaptability, everything is tested. And only a few manage to keep going. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing to keep exploring stories like this. Stories that reveal how life operates on a much larger scale than it first appears. Because as these migrations move forward, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Migration is not just about moving. It's about surviving every step of the way. As the migration pushes forward, there comes a moment when the path can no longer be avoided. It cannot be bypassed. It has to be faced. On the African savanna, that moment takes a very clear form: the rivers. For much of the year, they go almost unnoticed. But when the rains arrive, everything changes. Water levels rise, currents grow stronger, and what was once an easy crossing becomes a real barrier. When the herds reach the riverbanks, the movement stops. Thousands of wildebeest gather, tightly packed, restless, uncertain. They don't stop without reason. They know. The surface of the water looks calm, but it hides what cannot be seen. And still, staying is not an option. Behind them, resources have already disappeared. Time moves on. Tension builds. The herd shifts, advances, pulls back, reorganizes. Minutes pass, sometimes hours, until suddenly, without any clear signal, everything changes. One individual steps forward, and that is enough. Within seconds, hesitation turns into momentum. Hundreds, then thousands of animals surge into the water at once. The river explodes with impact. The current drags, separates, disorients. Bodies collide. Some lose footing. Others vanish beneath the surface. There is no coordination anymore, no control, only survival. But the greatest danger is not the current. Beneath the surface, nearly invisible, crocodiles wait. They do not chase. They don't need to. They watch. They choose. One isolated animal. One mistake. One moment. The strike is fast, silent. And then the water returns to stillness, as if nothing happened. And yet, the crossing continues. For every animal lost, dozens push forward. Some emerge on the other side completely exhausted. Others are injured. Many can barely stand. But stopping is still not an option, because the danger does not end at the water's edge. On the banks, predators are already waiting, watching the weak, the delayed, the ones who struggle to keep moving. And this moment is not an exception. It is part of the process. Elsewhere, the same kind of challenge appears in different forms. In northern rivers, salmon face waterfalls that demand absolute precision. Each leap is a risk. Every failure drains energy that cannot be recovered. In the ocean, invisible currents can shift entire routes, forcing whales to adapt in the middle of their journey. Migration has never been about choosing the safest path. It's about following the only path available. And at this stage of the journey, one truth becomes undeniable. Some obstacles leave no room for error, because there are crossings that offer no second chance. After crossing rivers, escaping predators, and covering vast distances, a new challenge begins to take over: the limits of the body itself. Until now, strength and endurance have made the difference. But at this stage, they are no longer enough. In the rivers of the Northern Hemisphere, salmon enter the final phase of their journey. They are no longer the same animals that left the ocean years before. Their bodies change, their colors intensify, and the signs of exhaustion become impossible to ignore. And still, they move forward. The current does not slow down. If anything, it grows stronger. Every yard demands more than the last. The jumps against waterfalls repeat again and again. Some succeed, others fail, and try again. But not all get that chance. For many, this is where the journey ends. And yet, their effort is not wasted. Those that don't reach their destination still become part of something larger. Their bodies remain in the environment, feeding an unseen network of life. Bears, birds, insects, even the surrounding vegetation depend on the nutrients carried inland from the ocean. It is a silent transfer, but an essential one. What begins in the sea ends up sustaining entire forests. And here, the logic of migration becomes clearer than ever. It is not only about arrival, it is about balance. In other parts of the world, this same principle appears in different forms. On Christmas Island, millions of red crabs leave the forest and begin a slow march toward the sea. The distance is not great, but the challenge is real. Heat, exposure, and predators turn every step into a test. And there is something else. Timing must be exact. Rainfall, lunar cycles, and tides must align with precision. If that balance fails, everything can collapse. Along their route, obstacles appear that never existed before. Roads, structures, barriers. And still, they continue. In some places, their numbers are so vast that the ground itself seems to move beneath them, a collective force impossible to ignore. When they finally reach the ocean, the effort reaches its peak. Females release millions of eggs into the water, synchronized with the rhythm of the tides. Most will not survive. But that is not the point, because in migration, success is not individual. It is collective. And that is what defines this stage of the journey. Here, endurance reaches its limit. And the cycle reveals its true nature. Because in the end, it is not about how many make it. It is about whether the movement continues. At a certain point in the year, the planet reaches a level of intensity that is rarely seen. Migrations that usually happen separately begin to overlap. Across continents, in the oceans, and through the skies, billions of animals are on the move at the same time. There is no coordination, no communication between species, and yet, everything appears perfectly synchronized. While thousands of wildebeest push across the African savanna, raising dust and reshaping the land beneath their hooves, millions of birds cross the sky along invisible routes that connect entire continents. At the same time, deep beneath the ocean's surface, whales travel thousands of miles in silence, guided by signals that span the globe. It is a simultaneous, global flow, impossible to witness from a single place, and yet it exists. And it sustains life as we know it. In Africa, the pressure does not ease. Predators continue to track every movement, waiting for any sign of weakness. In the oceans, newborns face their first days in an uncertain world. In the sky, a single miscalculation can end the journey. In colder regions, caribou move across vast distances, chasing food that emerges with the thaw. But time is limited. What is abundant today may disappear tomorrow. Insects hatch in massive numbers, conditions shift rapidly, and once again, movement becomes essential. This is the peak of migration, the moment when everything happens at once. Each movement creates an impact. Wherever these animals pass, ecosystems change. Vegetation is renewed, nutrients are redistributed, and entire chains of life are reshaped. A single migration can influence regions thousands of miles away, and when all of these flows align, the planet enters a state of dynamic balance, one that is incredibly fragile. But here, a critical reality emerges. The greater the synchronization, the greater the risk. Because any disruption, a drought, a shift in temperature, a change in climate, does not affect just one migration. It affects them all. And when that happens, the impact is no longer local. It becomes global. As migrations reach their most critical moments, a new factor begins to interfere with this ancient and precise system. But this time, the challenge is different. For the first time in the history of these journeys, the obstacles are not coming only from nature. Across different regions of the planet, routes that have been followed for thousands of years now encounter entirely new barriers. In the rivers of the Northern Hemisphere, dams interrupt the passage of salmon, blocking access to spawning grounds they once reached freely. Some manage to adapt, using artificial fish passages designed to maintain the flow. But not all succeed. And even a small delay can be enough to disrupt the entire cycle. Timing, once perfectly aligned, begins to fall out of sync. In Africa, the expansion of agriculture and the installation of fences reshape parts of traditional migration routes. While large areas remain untouched, even minor interruptions can redirect thousands of animals, concentrating them into smaller spaces and increasing pressure on limited resources. For species that depend on movement and open land, even a single barrier can trigger a chain reaction of consequences. Predators adapt as well, adjusting their territories and strategies to these new patterns. In other regions, the relationship between humans and migration takes a different form. On Christmas Island, the migration of red crabs is so significant that it has forced changes in the human landscape. Roads are temporarily closed, special crossings are built, and structures are designed to allow millions of individuals to pass safely. It is a rare situation, one where human systems adapt to the rhythm of nature. But even this balance is fragile. a small disruption can affect the entire synchronization of the event. In the oceans, the impact is less visible, but just as real. Changes in water temperature shift the distribution of food. Whales are forced to travel longer distances to feed, increasing energy demands and affecting their ability to reproduce. These are subtle, cumulative changes, slowly altering patterns that remained stable for centuries. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing to keep exploring how life on Earth is adapting to increasingly complex challenges. Because what we are witnessing is no longer just a natural cycle. It is an entire system trying to adjust to a new kind of pressure. Migration has always been an extreme test of precision and endurance. But now, beyond predators, distance, and natural obstacles, many species face something far less predictable. A world that is changing rapidly. And as those changes accelerate, the question begins to shift. It is no longer just about who will reach the destination, but whether that destination will still be there. Now, that balance begins to shift. Along certain routes, birds arrive. But something feels off. The food is no longer there. The timing has changed. What should have been a season of abundance becomes an empty space. In the oceans, whales follow ancient paths, but they are forced to swim farther than before to find what they need. The effort increases. Time becomes tighter. And the margin for error almost disappears. In Africa, the rains no longer arrive when expected. The land takes longer to respond. And when the herds finally move, they find less than they once did. The journey continues, but it becomes longer, harder, more uncertain. Elsewhere, the changes are quieter, but just as decisive. Butterflies begin their migration as they always have, crossing vast distances. But along the way, something is missing. The plants they depend on are gone. Resting points become scarce. Small absences, almost invisible, that slowly begin to change everything. None of this happens in isolation. These are subtle shifts, scattered and difficult to notice at first. But together, they begin to alter a system that depends on near-perfect precision. And still, the migrations continue. Millions of animals set out, following ancient routes, responding to signals that have existed for generations. But now, each journey carries a new uncertainty, an added risk that was not there before. Because for the first time, the greatest challenge of these journeys is no longer found along the path, but in the speed at which the world around them is changing. Despite all the pressure, the obstacles, and the changes, migrations continue. And that reveals something fundamental. They are not just a response to the environment. They are part of the structure that sustains life on Earth. When wildebeest cross the savanna, they are not simply searching for food. They reshape the land, regulate vegetation, and create space for new life to emerge. When salmon fight their way upstream, they are not just reproducing. They carry nutrients from the ocean deep into inland ecosystems, feeding entire networks of life. When birds cross continents, they disperse seeds, connect distant environments, and maintain cycles that extend far beyond their own survival. These movements create invisible connections between distant places. What happens in one region can influence another thousands of miles away. A shift in the ocean can impact life on land. The loss of a migratory species can disrupt entire food chains. Nothing exists in isolation. In some regions, human communities have learned to live alongside these cycles. For generations, they have observed these movements and adapted their lives to them. For many, the arrival of certain species is not just a natural event. It is a signal, a marker of change, of abundance, or of hardship. In Africa, for example, the Maasai follow the movements of large herds, adjusting their rhythms to match those of the land. It is not just coexistence, it is adaptation. At the same time, awareness is growing. Protecting these migrations is becoming essential, not only for the species themselves, but for global balance. Protected areas, wildlife corridors, and international efforts are emerging to preserve routes that cross human borders, but never belonged to any one place. Because migration does not belong to a country, it belongs to the planet. What makes this even more remarkable is that despite its complexity, there is no central control, no conscious coordination, no command system, and yet everything operates with extraordinary precision, shaped over thousands of years. A system built on something simple, movement, and perhaps that is the key. Life on Earth is not static. It depends on flow, on cycles, on constant movement. Migration is not an exception. It is one of its fundamental rules. When these movements unfold as they should, balance is maintained. But when they are disrupted, even slightly, the consequences spread. And what begins as a local shift can, over time, affect entire systems. Understanding great migrations is not just about witnessing a natural spectacle. It is about understanding one of the most essential mechanisms of life. Because in the end, these journeys do not just show where animals are going. They reveal how the planet continues to function. Across these migrations, one truth becomes clear. Migration is not a choice. It is a necessity. Different species, in completely different environments, follow the same principle. Move to survive. Adapt to continue. Persist, even when the cost is high. These journeys connect the planet in ways we rarely see. A river feeds a forest. An ocean sustains distant lands. A migration transforms everything it touches. Nothing is isolated. Everything is part of a system connected by these constant flows that maintain the balance of life. But that balance is changing, and still, the migrations continue. Year after year, millions of animals set out, facing risks and following ancient routes in a world that grows more unpredictable. Because in the end, migration is not just about reaching a destination. It is about keeping a cycle in motion, a cycle that supports not just one species, but life on Earth as a whole. If you've made it this far, you can support the channel with a like, subscribing, and telling us where you're watching from. That's what allows us to keep sharing stories like this, stories that reveal how life truly works. Because as long as the planet keeps changing, life will keep moving forward. And as long as there is movement, life goes on.